Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and this week I wanted to, since we're talking about um, the origin of an American empire at the turn of the 20th century with the Spanish American and the Philippine American War, um, I wanted to go ahead and give a little historiography lesson. Historiography refers to basically what historians have argued about history. um, Historiography is really important. If you are ever going to write a meaningful paper or article or even book about a historical subject, understanding the basis of historiography on the subject, what historians have said about it, how it has been received, and so forth, is extremely important. And so, as we move forward in thinking about empire this week, I wanted to introduce you to um, um, what some of the most significant historians since really the beginning of the 20th century have said about empire, about American foreign policy, so you can kind of have some perspective on the arguments that historians have made. The original historians on American foreign policy would be considered what we would consider nationalist scholars. And these scholars are associated with the early 20th century, and the most noted among them is Samuel Flagg Bemis, who was very famous for his really even still significant work on the American Revolution. Bemis's work on the American Revolution really it came out in the 1930s, and it was not in a lot of its arguments. It was not really challenged historiographically to a legitimate sense until the 1980s, when when a book called "The Diplomacy of the American Revolution," written by Jonathan Dahl. Yeah, Jonathan Dahl, right? A historian whose name is Jonathan Dahl. Oh my goodness. No, but Jonathan Dahl's book actually was a revolutionary book on the American Revolution. And it was really the first work to truly challenge, the diplomatic history at least, to truly challenge Bemis's interpretation of the American Revolution, which was, some 50 years after Bemis's um, book had came out. Nationalist historians like Bemis try to or do emphasize high level politics, diplomatic relations, and state to state interactions. Um, they tend towards American exceptionalism. And Bemis very much his interpretation of the American Revolution was, kind of weighted on the cunning and savvy and remarkable decision making of the American founders. Okay. Today, historians, beginning with Jonathan Dahl, they don't necessarily refute. They don't say that, well, the American founders were all a bunch of idiots. But what individuals like Dahl have argued is that the American Revolution's success was due far less to, you know, great victories at opportune times or having the right diplomat in the right place at the right time, and far more connected to the international environment, the luck of getting countries like the French and even the Spanish to support the United States indirectly. So scholars today generally will accept, when it comes to diplomacy, that the American Revolution was successful, probably for more than any other reason, because of the international environment, and less because of you know uh, the great decisions made by founders in the United States. Not to say you would say that those people made bad decisions or that those people were somehow inept, but simply that historians like Jonathan Dahl have reoriented how we think about the American Revolution. And those of you who have some understanding about the American Revolution, those interpretations probably sound rather familiar to you. When it comes to empire, which is what we are talking about this week, when you think about empire, the most significant historiographical school in the development of understanding in American empire, if you will, is a group known as the Revisionists. And the Revisionists emerged out of the late 1950s, but most in the 1960s. The 1960s were a time in which Americans were very much criticizing the government, very much thinking critically about American foreign policy, and this led to perhaps the most groundbreaking historical school of the 20th century, and one that is still deeply influential in the study of American empire. And this school is known as loosely as Revisionism, the Revisionists. Um, the Wisconsin school, which came out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, um, was really the most influential. It was kind of like during the 60s and the 70s, the Wisconsin school, which refers really to the history department or a group of historians in University of Wisconsin-Madison, who really revolutionized um, how we think or how we thought, how we talked about United States foreign policy and events like the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, World War II, and even the Cold War. These individuals looked at foreign policy, and their real critique um, for earlier historians was that early historians tended to emphasize international events exclusively, and they discounted the domestic driving forces of American foreign policy, and of empire. So the revisionists looked at it, and you have to think about foreign policy. So what is the motor of foreign policy? What makes foreign policy happen? Does foreign policy happen because the international environment pulls you in to engaging internationally? Or does foreign policy happen because there's domestic forces that are driving you to become engaged in the international environment? That's a very fundamental question at the discussion and the thinking about the origin of an American empire and of foreign policy in general. And that's something to think about even still today, of course. The revisionists generally argued that American foreign policy was due. They don't completely discount the external environment, but the driving factors are internal. And those driving factors relate to racism, to concepts of cultural superiority that justify war, to economic factors. Okay? And there's lots of evidence of these types of things, and the revisionist scholars remain today very, very credible, and they have provided some of the most lasting interpretations of American foreign policy. And when you look at the Vietnam War, you look at the Philippine-American War, you see that those wars are very much justified through, in many cases, through the lens of race and through a veiled understanding of cultural superiority. Now, the biggest thrust of the revisionist sort of critique of American empire, however, was economic. And the real kind of founding figures of these interpretations were William Appleman Williams, who wrote The Tragedy of American Foreign Policy, and his student Walter Lefebvre. And Walter Lefebvre is one of the greatest historians ever. And this is just based on, the success of his works, the manner in which they were received by other historians. Walter Lefebvre really was a groundbreaking historian. He wrote books like The New Empire, which talked about the establishment of an informal American empire that developed at the end of the Civil War period. Walter Lefebvre argued that the United States was an empire, but it was a new kind of empire, an empire that was based on, using your navy and your economic power to tie together global economic influence. He believed that during the period of industrialism, the United States expansively grew, its production power grew, and it produced all these commodities that needed markets. And so the United States basically expanded and established an empire, basically seeking markets for its commodities. It established itself as an informal global empire. Informal meaning not necessarily based on taking physical colonies. Walter Lefebvre, in his, it was an absolutely incredibly popular book on the Cold War, America, Russia in the Cold War, begins the narrative about the Cold War in the late 1800s by looking at Russia and looking at the United States as two expansive empires that were on a collision course. And of course, he's primarily interested in the American empire, which he believes is expanding because of economic drives, the need for markets, the need for commodity, the need for places to sell your commodities. Okay. Inevitable Revolutions was a 1983 work by Walter Lefebvre in which he argued that the revolutions in the Americas, in Central America, the conflicts in Guatemala, the conflicts in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, Walter Lefebvre argued that these conflicts were the result, an inevitable result, of an American empire that had dominated Central America throughout the 20th century and had done so for the benefit of large American corporations like United Fruit that the United States had a vested economic interest in supporting and facilitating their control of these areas. So the revisionists remain highly influential scholars, and there's been many. Alexander de Conde wrote his kind of revisionist critique about the acquisition of Louisiana, and he very much looks at foreign policy through the lens of culture and race. But the revisionist scholars, which are still highly influential today, though aspects of their works are criticized, they are particularly looking at internal motors driving foreign policy, and particularly the Wisconsin School scholars were looking at how capitalism, global capitalism, how industrial capitalism had driven the establishment of an American empire, that the motor was internal, and that it was basically a global capitalist economic push for empire that motivated the United States in expanding out in the Pacific, expanding its influence in the Caribbean and in Central America. Some might argue that, and some do argue that, the United States took a colony of the Philippines, which of course the United States colonized the Philippines, as you know, that the United States colonized the Philippines because of its strategic import. And that is partially true. But what is also true is that the Philippines were intended to be kind of a jumping off point for the trade with the open market in China as the United States sought to keep the door to China open. And that meant, with the open door notes of Secretary of State John Hay, that meant keeping China open for American investment, for American trade, not colonizing China. The open door notes of John Hay at the turn of the 20th century were designed not as like kind of a goodwill measure to China, but as a message to European powers to not colonize China, but to allow it to be opened up for free trade, particularly for the expanding economic interests of the United States. So the revisionists are one of the most potent examples of an economic interpretation of the domestic drives for American empire. In the 1980s, aspects of the revisionist approach fell under some criticism, and this led to the development of what can be called post-revisionism. And the criticism that was leveled on revisionist scholars, which, to some degree is apt, is that they had effectively, that revisionist scholars had effectively oversimplified history by effectively crystallizing everything down to economics and global capitalism. And the post-revisionists will increasingly engage narratives that seek to look a little bit more at a more complex array of history that fuses both domestic drives and international drives. So while revisionists were kind of almost obsessed with the domestic motor of foreign policy, post-revisionists acknowledge domestic motor of foreign policy. They acknowledge the significance of American ideology, of ideas of racial superiority driving foreign policy, of economic might driving foreign policy. But they also acknowledge international factors in driving foreign policy. And some of the most significant scholars are Michael Hunt, who you are reading from right now, who wrote a very famous work called Ideology and American Foreign Policy. And of course, we are reading from Um, his most recent work, which he combined with Hunt and Levine, combined together on it, and that's of course Arc of Empire. And I think as you read the introduction, you read the first chapter, you'll get a feel for how Arc of Empire kind of fits as a post-revisionist um, sort of interpretation of empire. Other scholars like John Lewis Gaddis, a very famous scholar, he's often been criticized as being somewhat triumphalist of American success in the Cold War. John Lewis Gaddis, who is famous for his work Strategies of Containment, which came out in the early 1980s. Individuals like Gaddis and Robert McMahon often acknowledge that the United States established an empire during the Cold War, but they insist that this empire was defensive, that it was created because of a real and legitimate international concern. So, Robert McMahon, for example, who wrote a very famous work on Vietnam called The Limits of Empire, his position was that, yes, the United States created an empire during the Cold War, or expanded its empire during the Cold War, but Robert McMahon insists that this was a defensive empire, that the United States did this not because it sought out its own kind of imperial dominance, but because it was trying to defend its institutions, defend its influence in the world against the sort of inevitable pressure of communism in the world. And so post-revisionists are oftentimes fusing the international and the domestic, acknowledging empire, acknowledging the drives of economics, acknowledging the drives of ideology, but also fusing the international component in understanding these events. And some are more critical than others. Robert McMahon, his interpretation of a defensive empire stands in stark contrast to Marilyn Young's interpretation of the Vietnam War, in which Marilyn Young very much argued that the Vietnam War was a product of basically self-interested imperialism on the part of the United States. Today, scholars emphasize a myriad of different influences in foreign policy. If you go back to the original nationalist scholars were generally only really interested in the decisions made by presidents and diplomats. Scholars today are looking at the influence of corporations, of multinational corporations, of transnational agents, of different nations, of different competing factors, of ideology, of economics, of various international events, and the complexities of the drives of American foreign policy and of the development of an American empire. Most historians will insist that the United States absolutely created an empire. Some will debate the degree to which we have an empire today in the United States, in the world, but generally speaking, no scholar would debate that the United States became an empire at the beginning of the 20th century, and some scholars say that this empire was just born at the beginning of the 20th century and continued to expand and is continuing to expand. Other scholars will suggest that the United States took a brief jaunt into imperialism and then recoiled from it. So historians debate and disagree about the nature of empire. They also debate and disagree on the drives of empire. And today, the best scholars are able to look at international events, the international pull, and they're able to balance that with the domestic push, and the domestic push relating to ideology, economics, and so forth. All right, guys. Well, I hope that's not too too weighty to think about. I wanted to give you a feel for how scholars deal with empire and the motives of empire and the causes of it and how they've argued about it. So hopefully it's helpful for you, and it's not just a waste of your time. I think it's an important lesson to understanding when you write a historical narrative, to understand what's been said about it. And historians often argue and disagree, and so what's been said about it, and when you look at what's been said about it, what are the prevailing accepted interpretations, and and how can something that you write fit into those interpretations? Interestingly, if I may make one last point, there's a book that came out a few years ago, and it was called The Business of Empire. It was written by a guy named Jason Colby, and he was interested in the um, American empire in Central America, particularly the role of the United Fruit Corporation in this empire. And traditionally, scholars had looked at American empire in Central America from the perspective of American policymakers and the decisions that American policymakers made. Jason Colby kind of turns that narrative on its head and makes the suggestion that the model for American empire in Central America, the United States established an informal empire in countries like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and so forth throughout the 20th century. Jason Colby says that actually the first driving force behind it was not the United States government, but actually a corporation, the Corporation of United Fruit, which kind of led the way in terms of providing a model for the United States government to follow in terms of imperial policy in places like Central America. So we kind of turn it on its head, and so you can kind of get a feel for how scholars have interpreted the motives and the driving forces of American empire differently through the years. So hopefully this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and let's have a great week.